It all started with something as simple as a grocery run. Ordinary, forgettable, routine. But by the time the sun set that evening, the quiet streets of my neighborhood were buzzing with police sirens, frantic whispers, and the ugly truth of just how far entitlement can go. You see, the HOA in this community had a reputation for being strict, but no one warned me about the family at the center of it, the kind of neighbors who thrived on intimidation, rules twisted to their favor, and the belief that their word was law. The spark came when their son, known for his arrogance and cruel remarks, decided my groceries were his to demand. His entitlement wasn't just bold, it was laced with something far uglier. And when I refused, when I dared to say no, his mother, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, called the cops on me. She thought she could use fear, authority, and lies to make me bend. But what she didn't know is that I wasn't the kind of neighbor you could bully. Because when those flashing blue lights pulled up, she was about to realize the one person she couldn't manipulate was the very person standing in her way. So how did a simple grocery trip spiral into a neighborhood scandal no one would forget? Before everything spiraled into chaos, life in my neighborhood looked almost picture-perfect. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns stretched across the cul-de-sacs, each home painted in warm shades of beige, brick, or soft blue. The community seemed welcoming to anyone driving through. Quiet streets where kids rode their bikes in circles, sprinklers ticked back and forth across green grass, and neighbors waved politely when they passed each other at the mailbox. On the surface, it was the kind of place you'd want to settle in, safe and predictable, tucked away from the noise of the city. When I first moved in, I had been drawn to exactly that sense of calm. My work was demanding, and I craved a sanctuary where I could unwind without constant stress knocking at my door. The house itself wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. A modest two-story with wide windows that caught the afternoon light, a backyard big enough for weekend barbecues, and a driveway where I could finally park without worrying about city street tickets. I had imagined growing roots here, building small rituals of everyday peace. At first, things felt promising. I got used to the hum of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the laughter of kids walking to the school bus, and the seasonal decorations that neighbors put up like clockwork. Some residents kept to themselves, others were overly chatty, but it all seemed manageable. I paid my dues to the homeowners association like everyone else, and I thought that was the end of it, just another minor expense to keep the neighborhood running smoothly. But in communities like this, appearances can be deceiving. What seemed like order and structure often hid layers of control, entitlement, and power struggles. The HOA wasn't just a group of well-meaning volunteers making sure the lawns stayed trimmed. It was a stage for petty politics, backroom decisions, and a few individuals, duels, who believed they held authority over everyone else's life. And at the very center of it all was one family, the kind of neighbors whose smiles never reached their eyes, who treated every sidewalk, fence, and parking space like it was their personal property. They were known in whispers more than in conversation. The mother, often referred to as Karen behind closed doors, had a reputation for filing complaints over the smallest infractions: trash cans left out 10 minutes too long, mailboxes painted a slightly different shade than approved, or kids laughing too loudly at the community pool. Her son carried himself with the same smug arrogance, walking the streets as though he owned them, quick to pick fights with anyone who dared challenge him. Most people in the neighborhood tolerated them quietly, choosing to keep their heads down rather than risk becoming their next target. At first, I tried to do the same. I kept my yard tidy, followed the HOA guidelines, and avoided unnecessary interactions. I figured if I respected their rules, I'd be left alone. But the thing about people who thrive on control is that compliance doesn't satisfy them. It only emboldens them. The cracks in the neighborhood's perfect facade began to show little by little, and I found myself catching glimpses of just how toxic things could get. There were the subtle warnings from longtime residents. Neighbors who leaned in close during casual conversations, lowering their voices as if the walls themselves were listening. "Keep your head down," one told me after I parked my car slightly crooked on the driveway. "They've made life miserable for people over less." Another shook their head when I repainted my front door. "Don't give her a reason," they muttered, not even saying Karen's name. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. After all, what was the worst that could happen? I wasn't breaking rules. I wasn't looking for conflict, and yet conflict seemed to have a way of finding me anyway. The first true glimpse of trouble came one ordinary weekend when I returned home with a trunk full of groceries. It had been a long day, the kind where all you want is to put things away and enjoy a quiet evening. As I unloaded the bags, I noticed Karen's son lingering nearby. His presence was hard to ignore. Arms crossed, posture stiff, a glare that wasn't just casual curiosity, but something sharper, something entitled. He made no effort to hide his stare as I carried bag after bag inside, as if waiting for an opening. I told myself not to make eye contact, not to invite whatever confrontation he was brewing, but when I came back out for the last load, he stepped forward. His words weren't friendly, and his tone carried the weight of someone who expected obedience. In that moment, a sense of dread prickled at the edges of my calm. I didn't know it yet, but this was the spark, the moment where a normal grocery trip would become the first domino in a chain reaction that would expose just how ugly this neighborhood could get. And as I shut the trunk, holding the last of my groceries in my arms, I felt the shift in the air. This wasn't going to be another passing annoyance. This was the beginning of something far bigger. Because sometimes the battles that shake a community don't start with lawyers or board meetings. They start with one entitled demand, one confrontation on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, and one choice, to stand your ground or give in. I had no idea then just how far this choice would take me. The confrontation over groceries might have seemed small to an outsider, but in neighborhoods like this, nothing ever stays small. Entitlement feeds on silence, and the moment you refuse to bend, you paint a target on your back. That was the moment my quiet life turned into a slow-burning war. At first, it started with paperwork. A formal notice from the HOA appeared in my mailbox just 2 days later. The envelope carried their emblem at the top and the sterile tone of authority inside. The complaint? Unapproved activity on the property. I read the lines twice, trying to make sense of it. Apparently, unloading groceries in my own driveway was deemed disruptive to the community aesthetic. It was so absurd I laughed, until I saw the fine printed at the bottom, $100 due within 30 days. Most people would have paid it, shrugged it off as the cost of peace. But something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. This was my driveway, my home, my space. If they could fine me for something so trivial, where would it end? I contested it, writing back with calm reasoning, attaching photos of my clean driveway and proof that I hadn't broken any rule listed in the bylaws. I thought logic would win out. Instead, a second notice arrived, this one sharper, colder. Failure to comply will result in further penalties. And with that, the floodgates opened. The harassment became systematic. Overnight, it was as though my home had been marked. I received notices about my lawn, even though I mowed it weekly. I was warned about unsightly trash bins, despite always bringing them in within hours of pickup. One letter scolded me for holiday lights that weren't in line with the approved neighborhood color scheme. The irony? I hadn't even put up lights that year. Each envelope carried the same weight of intimidation, the same subtle reminder that I was under watch. My once peaceful routine became a tightrope walk. Every trip to the mailbox felt like peeling back a new layer of hostility. And every time I thought it couldn't escalate further, it did. The neighbors began to shift too. People I'd once exchanged friendly nods with now avoided eye contact. Conversations hushed when I walked by. It wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. Karen and her circle thrived on isolation. If they could turn the neighborhood against me, they'd break me faster. Still, I held my ground. I documented everything, photos, timestamps, letters. I wasn't going to be bullied into submission. But standing firm only made me more of a target. The next blow came in the form of a community meeting. These gatherings were usually dull affairs, budget updates, landscaping proposals, the occasional debate about pool hours, but this one had an edge in the air. Karen sat near the front, her son beside her, both wearing smug expressions that told me I was on the agenda before the meeting even started. When my name was called, the accusations poured out like rehearsed lines in a play. Repeated violations, disruptive behavior, failure to respect community guidelines. They painted me as a troublemaker, a rebel intent on tearing down the order of the neighborhood. I stood there listening, my hands steady even as anger churned beneath my calm. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out the facts. Every baseless notice, every fabricated violation, every petty attempt to push me out. I presented my evidence clearly, logically. And for a moment, I saw doubt flicker across a few faces in the room. But Karen was quick to regain control, raising her voice, framing me as combative, uncooperative. Her son chimed in with exaggerated accounts of feeling unsafe, twisting the grocery confrontation into a tale of hostility. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with a vote to continue monitoring my property. In other words, the harassment was now officially sanctioned. From there, the pressure turned relentless. Anonymous complaints trickled in weekly. A crack mysteriously appeared in my mailbox one morning, followed days later by spray paint scrawled across the sidewalk in front of my home. Just faint enough to pass as an accident, but deliberate in its placement. Then came the noise. Late at night, when the neighborhood should have been quiet, I'd hear engines revving near my driveway, laughter echoing, footsteps across the edge of my lawn. When I turned on the lights, the figures vanished into the dark. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. This was personal. I reported it, of course, but every time the response was the same. Without evidence, there's nothing we can do. And in a twisted way, that was true. They were careful, never leaving enough behind to be caught outright, always skating the line between harassment and plausible deniability. Still, I refused to bow. If anything, their tactics hardened my resolve. I upgraded my security cameras, logged every incident, and kept records so detailed they could fill a binder. But the breaking point was closer than I realized. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day meant for rest. I had just come back from another grocery run when I saw him, Karen's son, waiting again near my driveway. His smirk carried the same entitlement as before, but this time he didn't bother with words. He walked up, bold as ever, and reached for one of my grocery bags as though it belonged to him. The audacity left me momentarily speechless. When I pulled the bag back, his face twisted with anger. He spat out words laced with venom, demanding, insulting, weaponizing the ugliest prejudices he had in his arsenal. His mother's voice carried from across the street, egging him on, framing me as the aggressor. And then, just like before, the phone came out. She was calling the police. But here's where the story shifted. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I wasn't just another homeowner she could bully into submission. I wasn't powerless, I was the law. That's when the real escalation began. Because in that moment, as the blue and red lights approached, she thought she was tightening the noose around me. What she didn't realize was that she had just walked into her own trap. And the fallout of that choice, the lies exposed, the power she thought she held crumbling, would shake not just her family, but the entire neighborhood. But before that fallout came the storm. Blue and red lights painted the neighborhood in sharp flashes, washing over the neatly trimmed hedges and manicured driveways. For most of the community, the sight of a police cruiser pulling into the cul-de-sac would be enough to send people peeking through their curtains, whispering behind closed blinds. But for Karen, it was validation. She stood in the middle of the street with her arms folded, chin lifted high, wearing the smug smile of someone who believed the law was about to do her bidding. Her son lingered at her side, still puffed up with false bravado. He paced in small circles like a predator who thought he had cornered his prey, throwing me glares that burned with entitlement and disdain. The grocery bags I had refused to hand over still sat on my porch, untouched, silent witnesses to the absurdity of what was unfolding. Neighbors began to gather. Some stood on their lawns, others peeked from their porches, a few recording with their phones. For weeks they had watched the slow boil of tension, the notices, the harassment, the whispers. But this was something new. This was spectacle. As the squad car rolled to a stop, Karen's expression hardened into satisfaction. She turned slightly, already preparing her story, already rehearsing the lies she would pour out the moment the officer stepped out. She had no idea. The door opened, and I saw the flash of recognition in the officer's eyes. It wasn't just a colleague stepping out of the cruiser, it was one of my officers. The moment he spotted me, his posture shifted from routine alertness to respectful acknowledgement. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying across the driveway. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen froze, her smugness cracking like porcelain. Her son's pacing stopped mid-step, confusion clouding his face. The neighbors leaned in, phones raised a little higher, as though sensing they were about to witness something worth replaying. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stood there, calm, grounded, as the officer walked toward me with the respect Karen thought she could command but never earned. Karen blinked, her lips parting in disbelief. "Commander?" she repeated, the words stumbling awkwardly out of her mouth. Her voice, once sharp with authority, now wavered. The officer glanced at her, then back at me, waiting. I nodded once, giving him permission to proceed. He turned fully toward Karen, notebook in hand, professional but firm. "Ma'am, can you explain the nature of your emergency call?" For the first time, Karen faltered. She opened her mouth, then closed it, fumbling with words. He was aggressive," she stammered, pointing at me. "He threatened my son. He refused to comply." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Refused to comply with what, exactly?" Karen shifted, her hands fluttering uselessly in front of her. With the rules, with community standards, with—" "Ma'am," the officer interrupted, his tone clipped now. "This is not a criminal matter. This is not an emergency. You called the police on your HOA neighbor because he didn't give you groceries?" The words sliced through the night. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone on a porch laughed, short and sharp, quickly stifled but impossible to ignore. Karen's son flushed red, his jaw tightening, but even he couldn't find a way to spin the absurdity of it all. I stepped forward then, my voice steady but laced with steel. "For weeks I've tolerated harassment, false fines, fabricated complaints, intimidation, and now this." I gestured toward the patrol car, the flashing lights still bathing the street. A misuse of emergency services, an attempt to weaponize the police for personal grudges. Enough is enough. Karen sputtered, her face blotching crimson. You can't talk to me like that. I'm on the HOA. Board, I have authority here." I met her gaze, unflinching. "Your authority ends where the law begins." The officer closed his notebook with a snap, turning fully toward Karen and her son. "Ma'am, sir, I'm going to strongly advise you to stop making frivolous emergency calls. You're wasting department resources, and you're disrupting this neighborhood. Consider this your official warning." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Phones captured every word, every shift in expression. Karen's reputation, once bolstered by fear and manipulation, was unraveling in real time. But I wasn't done. The next morning I filed a formal report, not just against Karen and her son, but against the HOA itself. I compiled weeks of evidence, the false fines, the letters, the vandalism, the intimidation. I submitted it through the proper channels, bypassing the HOA board entirely, ensuring it reached the city and legal authorities who oversaw housing disputes. And then I called for an emergency meeting, not at the HOA clubhouse where Karen ruled with her gavel and smirk, but at the community center down the road, a neutral space, a space where neighbors could show up without fear of being silenced. The night of the meeting ended in triumph, but anyone who's ever lived through a neighborhood battle knows the aftermath is just as important as the confrontation itself. Winning in the moment feels good, but the true measure of victory comes in what follows: the ripple effects, the lasting change, the way an entire community shifts because one person decided not to bend. When Karen stormed out of that community center, her power cracked like glass. For years, she had ruled by fear and manipulation, whispering threats through fine notices and hidden in the HOA's bylaws. But fear evaporates quickly once it's exposed. And now the whole neighborhood had seen her for what she truly was, not a protector of order, not a leader, not a figure of authority, but a bully. The days that followed carried a strange, almost surreal quiet. No more anonymous complaints in my mailbox. No new fines mysteriously appearing on my account. No strange cars idling in the night near my lawn. For the first time in months, I could breathe in my own neighborhood without the weight of paranoia pressing on my chest. But while the silence felt like relief, it was also the sound of transition, the calm before real consequences took hold. Because the investigation I had announced wasn't symbolic, it was real and it was thorough. The fall of the HOA. Within weeks, investigators arrived. They combed through HOA financial records, meeting minutes, correspondence. What they uncovered confirmed what many of us had suspected, but never had the proof to claim. Misuse of funds, selective enforcement of rules, intimidation tactics meant to silence dissent. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak before now came forward freely, their testimonies piling onto the evidence. Stories of arbitrary fines, targeted harassment, and vendettas disguised as community upkeep flooded the record. It became clear that Karen's grip on power had never been about protecting property values. It was about control. The board was dissolved, not temporarily, permanently. The HOA, once the looming shadow over every front yard and painted mailbox, was stripped of its authority. The city mandated new oversight, a restructuring that would require transparent elections, rotating leadership, and outside auditing of funds. For the first time, the neighborhood was free. And Karen? She wasn't just removed from the board. She was barred from holding any leadership position in future housing associations across the county. The very platform she had used to build her small empire of control was ripped out from under her. Karen's personal downfall, but the consequences didn't stop there. Karen had built her entire identity around her supposed power. Stripped of it, she found herself not just isolated, but publicly humiliated. The video clips from that fateful night circulated faster than any HOA memo she had ever sent. Neighbors shared them quietly at first, then openly, until the whole town knew her name. The moment that sealed her fate, the officer calling me commander in front of her, followed by her frantic lies crumbling under the weight of truth, became the neighborhood's favorite story to retell. At block parties, at school drop-offs, at backyard barbecues, people would whisper about it with a mixture of disbelief and relief. For Karen, there was no recovering from that. Her son, once swaggering with arrogance, could barely show his face without being met with smirks and raised eyebrows. He had wanted groceries that weren't his. Instead, he carried the burden of being the punchline to the story that ended his mother's reign. The pair retreated into their home, curtains drawn, appearances rare. And when they did emerge, the neighborhood's warmth was gone. The polite waves, the superficial greetings, the tolerance, it had all vanished. No one wanted to be associated with them. Control had turned into exile. A neighborhood reborn. But what about the rest of us? That was the real beauty of the resolution. With Karen's grip broken, the community began to breathe again. People who had once kept their heads down started to speak up. Conversations at mailboxes became friendly again, not hushed. Kids rode bikes freely without parents worrying that noise complaints would follow. A new spirit of cooperation grew where fear had once lived. We organized community events that weren't dictated by HOA rules, but by shared enthusiasm. Cookouts, yard sales, even a neighborhood watch that wasn't about control, but about genuine safety and care. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I was part of a real neighborhood, not a stage for power games, but a community of people learning to trust again. And perhaps most importantly, people remembered. They remembered how easily a few individuals had twisted authority. They remembered how silence had allowed it to spread. And they remembered how one confrontation had turned the tide. That memory became a shield, a reminder never to let it happen again. My own journey. For me personally, the resolution was more than just peace. It was validation. Every late night spent documenting evidence, every moment of anger swallowed in silence, every ounce of energy I had poured into resisting, it was worth it. But it also changed how I saw myself. I hadn't wanted to be a fighter. When I moved into this neighborhood, all I wanted was peace. But sometimes, peace isn't given. Sometimes it has to be defended. And standing my ground didn't just protect me, it freed my neighbors too. That realization carried weight. It reminded me of why I had chosen my career in law enforcement in the first place. Not to control, not to intimidate, but to protect. To stand firm when others couldn't. To remind bullies in every form that power has limits. The bigger picture, and maybe that's the most powerful takeaway from all of this. Because this wasn't just about me, it wasn't just about Karen. It was about a truth that stretches far beyond one cul-de-sac, one HOA, one neighborhood drama. Power, when unchecked, will always be abused. Whether it's in politics, workplaces, or yes, even homeowners associations, there will always be people who thrive on control, who mistake fear for respect. But power built on fear is fragile. All it takes is one moment of truth, one refusal to bend, one voice saying enough to bring it crashing down. And when that happens, something incredible follows. Unity, strength, hope. A lasting legacy. Months later, when the dust had fully settled, I walked down the same street where it had all begun, the quiet cul-de-sac where groceries turned into warfare. The lawns were still trimmed, the houses still painted in neat suburban tones, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Where there had once been suspicion and whispered warnings, there was now laughter, openness, trust. Neighbors waved not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted to. Children played without fear of being reported. The neighborhood finally felt like the home I had dreamed it would be. Karen's house stood as a relic of the past, blinds drawn, yard neglected, the silence around it deafening. But beyond that shadow, the rest of us had moved on, stronger than before. And as I passed by, groceries in hand, I couldn't help but think back to the night everything changed. The flashing lights, the lies unraveling, the moment the power shifted. A grocery trip had become a war, and the war had become a turning point. Final takeaway. So here's what I'll leave you with. If you've ever felt trapped in your own community, silenced by rules that make no sense, bullied by people who mistake authority for power, remember this story. Remember that fear only works when we let it. Stand your ground. Document everything. Find your voice. Because sometimes it takes just one person saying enough to turn an entire neighborhood around. And when the dust clears, when the bullies retreat, when the fear evaporates, you'll be left with something far more powerful than control. You'll be left with community. And that's worth fighting for.